Hello everyone, my name is Paul Tavel, and in this video from the Gospel Online, we'll be looking at the question of when was the Bible written? This is a really important question which has implications for how much we can trust what the Bible actually says. We're going to see some archaeological evidence that can help us with that question, and how the Bible has its own internal evidence and logic, which we can use then to date it. This is what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to see some of these evidences for how the Bible was written and how it was put together and how it came down to us through the years. And we're going to look at an idea of a timeline as to when we can date some of the books as well. Before we begin, I would just remind you to please subscribe to the channel below to see more of these videos, and press the notification button for a message every time a new one is posted on the channel. Now, some people have tried to claim that the books of the Bible were written much later than they purport to be. And there are two main reasons for this, if you want to discredit Christianity. And firstly is to say that prophecies supposedly made in advance of events in Scripture were actually written after the events they're meant to have predicted. And secondly, to allow time for a legendary myth about Jesus to arise, which means uncertainty over whether he actually existed or not. So that's a couple of reasons why people try and claim that the books of the Bible were written much later than we are going to suggest today. And what we're going to do in this talk then is to examine the evidence that counters some of those claims. So firstly, here is a rough timescale of when the books of the Bible were believed to be written. And what I've done is I've put all the books up there, all 66 of them, in little coloured blocks, and you'll see two separate timelines below them, and lines from the books to the time that they were completed, roughly speaking anyway. And we can see that Genesis to Deuteronomy, for example, the blue section there, the law, was probably written by Moses around 1450 or so BC. And then you can see the green section, the history ranges in date much more widely, from Joshua around 1420 BC to Ezra and Nehemiah, probably 1,000 years later. You can see the purple section has a very wide range there. The first book, Job, in the writings, was perhaps the first one to be written way back. And then the Psalms and Proverbs and so on, dating to a much later time period. In the red books there, the prophets, you can see that they range over around half of that timeline below them, ranging from perhaps Amos and Jonah around the mid-700s to Malachi in around 420. So a period of about 300 or 400 years there. And then moving on to the New Testament and its own separate timeline there, you can see the yellow books, the Gospels, written between about 45 and 60 AD there. And then Acts, the slightly orangey book there, a bit later on, around the year 62, I suggest. Then we've got a large letter section, the brown section there, covering the 50s and 60s. And then you can see that last book, the book of Revelation, the book of prophecy, probably dating to somewhere between 80 and 90. Now, of course, the manuscripts available to us today don't reach right back to those dates. So how can we be sure then that the text has not changed since those books were originally written? Well, let's have a think about how these books were first written. We can see in this passage from Deuteronomy 31 that originally those first books there were taken and placed in the ark. You can see from that verse 26 there, take this book of the law and put it in the side of the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, commanded Moses. way back in the very early days, so that the books were treasured and were looked after and were kept somewhere safe in the side of the ark, something like this model here, a very elaborate gold-plated box that was kept in the tabernacle and that was deemed as extremely special. So the books were certainly well looked after when they were first written. And you can see many hundreds of years later in the second book of the Kings that it was proclaimed by Hilkiah the high priest, "I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord," meaning at that time the temple that later replaced the tabernacle structure. And so it was kept in a very safe place in the tabernacle, in the temple, for many hundreds of years. Here's an image of what the temple would have looked like in Jerusalem. And this book was then used to make copies. So, for example, the command back in Deuteronomy was that a king was to make a copy of the law from that book that was first written by Moses. And many copies were made throughout the years. And of course, it was the scribes who had that job and whose task it was to take great care and diligence over every letter that they copied to make sure that text was accurately transmitted. After this temple was destroyed in 586 BC, the Book of the Law was reconstructed according to Jewish tradition from surviving parts of these standard copies that had been made over the years. And that new standard text was again placed in the temple that was made after, and further books added to it over time. More and more copies were made by these same people, by the scribes, to make sure that text came down accurately transmitted through the years. And when the temple was then destroyed again, Herod's temple, this was in 70 AD, the scribes and the rabbis rapidly put together a standard text, again from the surviving manuscripts, and that was called the Masoretic text. And here are a couple of examples of it. And all through the time these copies were being made, there were tests that could be applied to make sure that the text matched up with the other copies that were in existence. There were all sorts of tests based on the number of characters per line and marks in the margin to try and ensure that the accuracy was as high as possible. And in fact, when we compare these existing manuscripts today, we can see that the amount of variation is incredibly small for something that's been produced in this way. And the variations are mainly in the marginal notes made by the scribes as the copies were made. Now, today, the oldest copies of this text, the Masoretic text that we have, are these here, the Aleppo Codex from around 920, and the Leningrad Codex on the right there from just slightly later, the 10th, the 11th century AD. Appreciate that's a little bit of time after the first copies of this text would have been made, but we can get closer to what the originals would have said by looking at other texts that survive. And a great example of that is the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this has had quite a bit of publicity over the last few years. What the Dead Sea Scrolls are is Hebrew and Aramaic copies of the Old Testament dating back to roughly the 3rd century BC on to the 1st century AD, that 300-400 year period there. And because they date back a good 800-900 years further than the existing copies of the Masoretic text that we have, they form a really useful way of checking the accuracy of these texts. We can actually compare the Dead Sea Scrolls with the Aleppo and Leningrad codices and check for the variations and check for the differences between them. And we can see that very little error, very little variation has crept in over all of those centuries. We can see that the copying has been done very faithfully indeed. And these help us to show that the Old Testament really does date from the time before Christ. It isn't something that was created after the event and made to look as though it was written earlier. And of course, that's a really important point to be able to prove the genuineness of the prophecies that the Old Testament makes. Just as an example of this accuracy, then, there was a researcher called Abegg who studied these Dead Sea Scrolls and found that out of the 929 chapters that they cover between them, there were just 71 significant variants from the texts that we have available elsewhere. That's about one variant every 13 chapters of the Old Testament, so an extremely small number. And of those 71 variants, the vast majority makes very, very little difference to what the text is actually saying. 28 of them involve just one word or phrase with no effect on the meaning of the narrative whatsoever. 37 involve a few words, maybe a whole line of text, but still have no effect at all on the overall meaning of the passage. And then there are just 6 variants which have some effect on the meaning of the passage, but even then they don't significantly change the actual doctrine or the actual belief, the actual part of what the Old Testament is saying overall. They provide no evidence to change one's belief based upon that variation. It merely removes a tiny part of the evidence used to back up those beliefs. So of all those variants, none of them can actually make any appreciable difference to what the text is really meaning in terms of our belief in what it says. So as well as the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in this cave at Qumran here about 70 years ago, as well as using those as evidence, we also have the evidence of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the whole of the Old Testament. And the great thing about these manuscripts is that they are very well quoted in other contemporary writings, and that helps us to be really sure of the date that they started to be circulated. So here are a couple of quotes from some scholars here. The first one there, the scholarly consensus is that the Septuagint was completed by the end of the 1st century before Christ. And the one just below, the books and the prophets and the writings of the Old Testament were translated later than the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the law, but probably all of them by about 130 BC, as suggested by, and here's an example of another writing that we have, the Greek prologue to Ben Sira. Now, the most part of the Septuagint, then, we can be fairly sure was produced long before the birth of Christ, and in fact, this scholar is saying that all of it, he believes, was completed by 100 or so years before Christ came on the scene. And let's see some of that other evidence in other writings that we've got to prove this idea then. So here's some archaeological proofs that the Septuagint was translated by the Jews before the birth of Christ. So it predates the birth of Christ. And here are some examples. So in 176 BC, there was a footnote made to the Greek book of Esther, which says that the book was brought to Egypt in the 4th year of Ptolemy and Cleopatra. And the general consensus of the scholars is that refers to Ptolemy Philometor, who was around in 176 BC. So we can be fairly happy with the dating of that particular part of the Septuagint, the Greek book of Esther, to around 176 BC. We have many other examples like that. So a little bit later on, we have Eupolemus, who is mentioned in First Maccabees, one of the books of the Apocrypha, and he quotes chronicles from the Septuagint, and we know that his work dates from that time. And in the same year, we have Aristeas the exegete, who quotes extensively from the Greek book of Job, and therefore the book of Job must have been in existence in the Septuagint by 150 BC. And we can go on. The original prologue to Ecclesiasticus, which dates from 132 BC, according to that scroll which was discovered with it, it refers to the law, the prophecies, and the rest of the books that already existed in the Greek before this point. So they've already been translated in the Septuagint in the Greek by 132 BC, when we can date our surviving text to. A little bit later on, there's another letter from Aristeas, which quotes Job 42, verse 3 out of the Septuagint. So by 130 BC, that book must have existed in Greek. And we keep going on. A little bit later, we've got the dating of the Nahal Hiva Greek scroll of the 12 minor prophets in all its 32 feet length. And that dates pretty comprehensively to around 50 BC. Around the same year, we've got Hebrew manuscripts of the shorter version of Jeremiah the prophet, found at Qumran, so alongside the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that scroll is dated to around 50 BC. And then a little bit later on, we've got a man called Philo of Alexandria, who quotes extensively from almost every single book of the Septuagint, and yet never mentions Jesus. So again, we can be fairly sure that predates most of the account of the life of Christ, at least in the public eye anyway, that began in around the 30s AD. So there's plenty more like that. They're just some examples of how we can use archaeology and how we can use these letters and these pieces of writing that exist now that quote the Septuagint to actually help us be very sure about the date of the Septuagint before the birth of Christ. And here's an internal example from the Bible text of why this is such an important point. Here is a verse from Isaiah chapter 7 in the Old Testament. It gives us a useful example of a prophecy concerning Christ. It says, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." And it contains in the Hebrew the word alma, which means an unmarried woman, not necessarily a virgin, but certainly an unmarried woman. But when it came to be translated into the Greek, when the Septuagint was being made, the translators deliberately used the Greek word parthenos, which is unquestionably the Greek term for a virgin. It's used of the Virgin Mary, it's used of the 10 virgins in Matthew 25, for example. It's used in other places where it can only mean virgin. And we know that that's the word they used because that's what appears when Matthew quotes the passage. So Matthew's gospel quotes the Septuagint. It's the Septuagint translation that appears in the Greek text of Matthew's gospel. And parthenos is the word that appears here. And so Matthew, by using that word, shows that they understood the prophecy. They understood that it would be an extraordinary birth that would bring Jesus into being, and something other than normal childbirth within marriage. And so we can see that the word parthenos or virgin in the Septuagint it predates Christ's existence. So it was a prophecy, an accurate prediction of something that had not yet happened. And of course, if there's one prophecy that's accurately been made, then why can't others also have been made? And Matthew uses the Septuagint version when he puts his quote in to show that Jesus had been born in a miraculous and unusual way. Now, of course, if the Old Testament prophecies about Christ really were made centuries before he was born, then that raises the question of how we might account for their accuracy unless the Bible really was inspired by God. I wonder how you're finding this video so far, and maybe you've come across some further evidence that helps us to date these texts. And if you have, we'd love to know. Please put a comment below the video. We're going to move on now to dating the New Testament. Now, some people believe the New Testament documents are not trustworthy, but we're going to see how they compare to other ancient documents. So here we have on the screen a guide to the number of existing early records we have available today for these different pieces of writing. So here are, these are all ancient documents. They're all taken to be reasonably accurate about the history that they happen to record. We've got some accounts of wars there by Julius Caesar. We've got some histories. We've got Homer's account of war there as well. And we want to look at the number of copies that survive to this day. That's one of the tests of accuracy that experts apply to these early texts. And you can see that there's really no comparison. We have 10, 7, 8 copies of most of these writings. We have a lot more copies of Homer's Iliad, going up to 600, which indeed sounds like a lot compared with those other writings. But then you put the New Testament alongside it, and you see that actually we've got over 24,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, either full or fragments, dating back to early times. So the New Testament really is without parallel. It's the most well-attested early writing by far when you put it alongside any other contemporary writing from ancient times. Now, some scholars have suggested that the date for a lot of the New Testament is very late in the 1st century or even early in the 2nd century AD. One man, Carrier, would even claim that the Gospels were written after 150 AD. And this is all based partly on the age of the oldest manuscripts available to us today. So some people take the approach that they'll look at how old the earliest extant manuscripts that we have now are, and they will date the writing itself to not much before that, not much before the date of the earliest manuscript we have available today. Now, others date them a different way. But of course, the extra motive for trying to push the date later in time is that it stretches the credibility of the historical Jesus Christ, because it gives enough time then, enough generations to have passed since Jesus was actually around for legends to have arisen and for myths to have developed about his resurrection and about his miracles. And it can then be argued by some that he is more of a mythical figure than a real one, that he is more legendary than historical. And some people have that motive that they want to try and denigrate the historical Jesus and try and claim him to be a legend. Of course, legends take time to develop. However, we can't ignore the internal textual evidence that the Gospels and the letters contain. And looking at these bits of evidence actually brings the date much earlier and much closer to the events and people in the books. So we're going to demonstrate that by just looking at a few of the New Testament books and the early evidence that they give us. So starting with Acts here, what Acts is the narrative account of the spread of the gospel in those early days after the Lord Jesus Christ. And if you were to go to Wikipedia, I'm going to use Wikipedia as our example of the voice of contemporary scholars today that says this is when we reckon these books to have been written. So if you go to Wikipedia, you will see that it dates a book like Acts to around 80 to 90 AD, something like that. And what I've put on the screen here is, while we're looking at this, is I've put a rough timeline, and then I've put underneath that timelines the generations that have passed after the resurrection. So the resurrection of Jesus in about 30 AD, and you can see every 20 years I've put a generation marker, so you can see the first generation after the resurrection, and the second and the third, and just into the fourth there. And we're going to find that a useful guide to what this dating implies. The more generations that pass after the event, then the fewer people are left, of course, who are eyewitnesses to that event. And of course, by the end of the century, there are likely no eyewitnesses left at all. And that's going to be really important in what we're considering. Now, Let's look at the internal evidence then in the book of Acts, and we'll find that we can move this date timeline much earlier. For a start, we know that the book of Acts contains no information whatsoever about the death of Paul, one of the key major characters in the whole book. We know that Paul died under the Emperor Nero. Nero died in about 68 AD. But not only does it contain no information about Paul's death, we also don't have any information about his trial before Caesar himself. The book finishes even before he appears before Caesar. The book ends before he gets to his final place of trial. So because there is nothing recorded about those important and significant events in Paul's life, we can be fairly sure, I think, that we can't date Acts any later than the time those events actually took place. And so I think those facts brings us to be able to date the book of Acts to no later than 67, after which point we have the trial of Paul, the death of Paul, the death of Nero, all these events which would surely have been recorded in the book if they had happened before the book was written. But we can go further than that. There's no reference in the whole book to the Jewish wars that began in the mid-60s or to Nero's persecution of Christians, which appeared around the same time. Relations between Rome and the church appear very good all the way through the book, really. And to have them not mentioned, if they really had happened at the time the book was written, would be a bit like a reporter failing to mention World War II when he was on assignment in Paris in the early 1940s. You just wouldn't expect that to be the case. You wouldn't expect there to be no mention of these important events that were taking place at the time. We also have a very confident tone in the book of Acts. It seems unlikely that that tone would be there during the persecutions by Nero of the Christians and the Jewish war with Rome, which aren't. So a late date for Acts just seems completely out of character with these events not being there, and also the picture of the Romans being friendly and positive towards the Christians, certainly towards the end of the book. So we can date it to before around the mid-60s when those events started to take place. We also know that Luke records the martyrdom of Stephen and James during the book, and yet he writes nothing about the martyrdom of Paul in around 67, the martyrdom of Peter in around 67, maybe slightly before, or even James the Elder, who died around 62, according to Josephus, a first century historian who's known for his accuracy when writing about Jewish history. And if we can bring it back to 62, then perhaps we're getting fairly close to the truth there about the actual time that Acts was written. 62 seems a reasonable date based upon these facts and based upon what the book itself actually records and doesn't record. And that probably fits with around the time of the start of Paul's 2-year house arrest, which happens right at the end of the book of Acts. So you can see how we've brought the date of the book much further back, just looking at the internal evidence, some of those things that it contains and doesn't contain, and what logically that implies. Let's move on then, having set that date, to the book of Luke. So Wikipedia places Luke around here. It gives it a fairly broad time span there, somewhere between 80 and 110 AD. But let's have a look again at the internal evidence of this book to think about where realistically it might be dated. So firstly, we've got some evidence from other books. We can see that 1 Timothy chapter 5 actually quotes Luke 10. So Paul in his letter to Timothy here writes, "The laborer is worthy of his reward." And that's pretty much identical Greek to the passage in Luke 10 verse 7, translated slightly differently in some English versions, but the Greek underlying it is identical. The laborer is worthy of his hire. So if Luke's gospel is being quoted by Paul writing to Timothy, then Luke must have been written before Paul's death, around 65 to 67 AD. We also know that the Gospel of Luke must come before Acts because it's mentioned in the first verse of the book of Acts, where Luke, the writer of Acts, records what he wrote previously in his Gospel. So if we've dated Acts to 62, then Luke must be at least 61, 62 in its date. And then we have an interesting verse in 2 Corinthians, which can help us bring that date of Luke backwards. In 2 Corinthians, Paul writes about the brother whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches. And this is almost certainly referring to Luke. Many early writers, Origen, Eusebius, Jerome, Chrysostom, all say that this is Luke that Paul is referring to. It seems to fit the bill. And a way that he might have had praise throughout all the churches, of course, is that he has written a gospel book by now, which has spread to every church in the area. He's become well known because of this gospel that he's written. Now, 2 Corinthians was written around 56 AD when Paul was in Macedonia. We can be fairly happy with that date. And so it means Luke, the gospel, must have been written long enough before that date to have then circulated widely amongst the churches for Luke to have been well known, for his praise to have been in this gospel that he's written. So I think that really helps us to date the Gospel of Luke back to around 54, a couple of years before 2 Corinthians was written in that visit of Paul's to Macedonia. So that brings the Gospel of Luke right back to a realistic date of around the mid-50s there. The Gospel of Matthew, Wikipedia places it here, around 80 to 90 AD. Many scholars would think that was being fairly generous. We can look at the internal evidence once again. Matthew refers a few times to things in the present day. So he says the field of blood where Judas was buried was called the field of blood unto this day. And that suggests a date of pre-70 AD, because we know the whole of Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. It would have been unrealistic to try and recognize places by place names after that date when it was destroyed by the Roman army. And so we can be fairly happy with the implication there that Matthew must have been written before Jerusalem was destroyed in order for it to make sense to his readers there. This day actually implies maybe that some time has passed since the events were recorded. So we could perhaps push that even further back on that piece of evidence, but we'll leave it there for now. We also know the Sadducees are present in the book. The Sadducees virtually disappeared after the Jewish revolt and the destruction of Jerusalem. The Jewish revolt a little bit earlier, around 66 AD. So for them to have been mentioned here implies it would have had some sort of relevance to Matthew's readers, and he probably wouldn't have mentioned them after the date of about 66 AD when they really started to disappear as a class. And then after the martyrdom of James, we know that Simeon, son of Clopas, took over as leader of the church in Jerusalem, but Matthew never mentions him. Now, even in verses that describe his mother Mary being the mother of James and Joseph, you would expect that if Simeon had risen to prominence by the time of Matthew's gospel, he would have also mentioned Simeon in that reference to the family there. And because he doesn't, it carries that implication that Matthew was probably written before Simeon rose to providence in 62. So let's put Matthew at no later than around 61 AD, based on that omission of Simeon's name from the text. And you can see how once again we've brought that date much further back in time and much closer to the resurrection. The Gospel of John, traditionally it's given a very late date, so pushing into that 2nd century AD. But when we look at the internal evidence once again, we can see that lots of mentions of places in Jerusalem are in the present tense. There is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool, John writes. Now, that would have made very little sense after 70 AD when Jerusalem was destroyed. So we can say if John is writing about these places for his readers to be able to locate and understand, then he's writing that before 70 AD. And we have some backup from contemporary writers there. Hippolytus, the earliest of all the church historians, whose writings only exist now in quotations by others, but nevertheless, we know what he wrote, and he was sure that John wrote before 70. So we also have other writers backing up that point. It was also before Hebrews that John wrote. I think we can be fairly happy with that. Hebrews itself is dated to pre-70 AD, pre the destruction of Jerusalem, because again, it speaks in the present tense of high priests officiating at the altar. But in Hebrews chapter 11, it calls Isaac the only begotten son of Abraham, which many believe to be an allusion to the same phrase, the only begotten son, in John chapter 3 and verse 16, that well-known verse. So if Hebrews is alluding to John's verse there, then of course John must predate Hebrews. And if we can date Hebrews to around 68 AD, we can bring John a little bit further back as well. And there's some other points as well. Peter wrote the following. He wrote, "Shortly I must put off this my tabernacle, even as our Lord Jesus Christ showed me." He wrote that in 2 Peter 1 and verse 14. And we believe that's an allusion to the last chapter of John's Gospel, when Jesus talked about the kind of death Peter would die. So if Peter is alluding to the last chapter of John's Gospel there, and we know Peter died in about 66 AD, we can bring John back once again. It must have been written before Peter died. And of course, it could have been written much earlier than all of these dates, and all of these books we've looked at could have been written earlier. What we're doing is merely establishing the latest date, that they can feasibly, reasonably have been written based on what the text itself actually includes and omits. And we're going to just consider the synoptic gospels generally here as well at the bottom. There's some evidence that applies more generally in terms of proving that at least one of the gospels must have been written by a certain date. And taken as a whole, Wikipedia thinks there must have been a gospel in existence by around this date. So stretching across that key year of 70 AD when Jerusalem was destroyed. The thing is, if the Gospels contain predictions of AD 70, as they do, if they were written after the event, if they were written after AD 70, then we would expect the references they make and the predictions they make about that important event to be much more accurate than they actually are. So, for example, in Matthew 22, it talks about this terrible event coming, and it says the king sets the city on fire. But the city wasn't actually burned in AD 70. The temple was, but the city itself in Jerusalem wasn't burned. So that's actually a little bit of an inaccurate comment if it was made after the event actually took place, after 70 AD. Another example is where Jesus told his disciples to pray that it may not happen in the winter. That appears in Mark 13, verse 18. But we know that Titus destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in the summer. It was July, August 70 AD, according to the Mishnah Tanith. And so to have Jesus commenting about the winter there doesn't make much sense if this text was written after the event. That wouldn't have been included in the text, would it? Jesus wouldn't have been included as saying that if it was irrelevant, because it actually happened at a different time of year. Another point is that Jesus told his disciples to flee to the mountains, Luke 21, verse 21. And yet historically we know Eusebius and Epiphanes all tell us that the Christians fled to Pella, which is a place lower than Jerusalem. They went downhill, in other words, from Jerusalem. So Jesus may have told his disciples to do one thing, but in the actual event, when it came to pass, the Christians tended to flee lower. And so all of these points indicate that we're looking at a text that was written before the event itself in AD 70 actually took place. Otherwise, it wouldn't have included these details that then end up looking inaccurate as a result of the event having taken place in a different way. We've got some of those on the screen there. Just that one from Mark 13. And then there's this other point here. So Paul writes in 2 Timothy, he says to Timothy, from a child you have known the Holy Scriptures. So Paul urges Timothy to continue in the Scriptures that he has known since childhood. And if we were to read a bit more around that passage in verse 16 there, they are the Scriptures that teach salvation through Jesus Christ. So the implication is Timothy has some Scriptures that he's known since childhood that tell him about salvation through Jesus Christ. And that can only be referring to New Testament scriptures that talk specifically about salvation through Jesus Christ. And the implication here then is that some New Testament writings have been available for 15 years or so before Paul is writing to Timothy here. And we can date Paul's letter to the early 60s, perhaps 60 AD itself. And this brings the date of the Gospels, or at least one of the Gospels, way back now to something like 48 AD. If Timothy has known a Gospel since childhood, if he's had that available to him to learn about salvation through Jesus since he was a child, then that brings at least one New Testament Gospel back to the 40s AD. And of course, when we think about it, that does make perfect sense, that there must have been a need for an authoritative account of the life of Christ not long after his death. There must have been a need for these things to have been written down and circulated widely, something that carried some authority, something that was written by eyewitnesses, something that had that mark of genuineness stamped upon it. Why would these people have waited years and years and years and decades, as Wikipedia would have us believe, before writing down an authoritative account of the life of Christ? A late argument doesn't really make much sense when we think about it logically. And maybe we can actually date this to more like 40 AD, something just a handful of years after the resurrection itself. Perhaps it makes more sense for us to think in these terms, that there must have been a gospel at least available in much earlier days. The whole point then is that all these books we've brought much further back in time, and we've brought them back to within the time when witnesses to these events are around. So I've put this line, this bar here at around the second generation after Christ. Up to that end of that second generation, we can expect that witnesses would have been around who would have seen Jesus, who would have known him, who would have witnessed the events in Jerusalem around 30 AD at the time of the resurrection. And after that line, they would have become very hard to find. So we've brought, using these internal evidences, we've brought the dates of all those books to within that time frame when there would have been witnesses around, and they could have attested to the accuracy of the portrayal of Jesus. That window for eyewitnesses probably lasts 2 generations, and it's a really important point in the whole credibility of the New Testament that we've been able to do that, to bring those writings within that time frame. So those estimated dates from Wikipedia were all outside this frame, and they're based, as we said, on looking at the archaeological evidence available to us today and looking at the manuscripts available to us today and dating those manuscripts. But actually, they're missing out on all this internal evidence, all this logical implications that comes when you look at what these books actually say and what they miss out. And it's forgetting, of course, that new manuscripts tend to turn up as the years pass by, and who's to say that in another 10 years we won't have found much earlier manuscripts of the New Testament, and that the scholars will need to rework all their dates all over again. Some parts of the New Testament actually tell us to go and ask the eyewitnesses, don't they? In 1 Corinthians 15, we have this comment by the Apostle Paul as he's writing that Jesus was seen in those early days of above 500 brethren at once. And he adds this comment in, of whom the greater part remain unto this present. And the lovely implication in that verse is that his hearers in Corinth could have gone and asked those eyewitnesses. They could have asked them all about Jesus. They could have asked them all about what they saw and their own account of the resurrection and all those events they would have witnessed. And because we've brought those books much further into that period where there were eyewitnesses around, it makes the whole lot of them much more reliable, because they could have been contradicted by any witnesses that existed at the time. They could have been laughed out before they circulated very far if what they were recording was actually in discrepancy with what those eyewitnesses saw. The very fact those books survived the time when there were plenty of eyewitnesses around and carried on circulating as they were implies that the eyewitnesses would not have contradicted the things that the writings actually said. Finally, let's consider one last important implication regarding when the books were written, and that's the fact we've got a very consistent message throughout the Bible. And in fact, even Gentile kings add to this consistent message. It's not changed across centuries. And here's a couple of examples. Here's King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, a few hundred years before Christ. And he wrote this. He actually wrote a part of what we had as the book of Daniel. And he says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and I blessed the Most High, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. So this king, this powerful king of Babylon, who once was so keen to persecute those believers of Israel's God, actually confesses at this point in his life, after he's been tested and punished, he actually confesses his faith and recognizes that his dominion has actually resulted in Nebuchadnezzar being king. So God has been in charge of all the kings of the earth, including Nebuchadnezzar, and God is the one who has given Nebuchadnezzar his kingdom. That's the implication in what Nebuchadnezzar is writing there. And a little bit further on in time, we have another Gentile king, Cyrus, the king of Persia, who came a bit later, 100 or so years after Nebuchadnezzar, and he writes pretty much the same thing. We have that recorded for us in our book of Ezra, chapter 1. There says, Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth. And it's the same message, and it's in the mouth of another Gentile king who comes to believe in the Lord God of Israel. He would have no earthly reason for deliberately writing something that was in harmony with Nebuchadnezzar. So there's no particular reason for this consistency other than the fact that what they're writing reflects the truth, reflects that consistent message of the Bible that people come to believe through what they see with their eyes, through what they witness, through their experience, that it really is the Lord God of heaven who is in charge of all the kingdoms of the earth and who has given them their respective kingdoms. There are plenty of examples, as you might imagine, of that consistent message throughout the Bible, but we'll just take that one example as we finish now. So we hope you've enjoyed that video. Please let us know what you thought to it in the comments section below. And please feel free to leave any suggestions for what you'd like to see discussed in further videos as well. They'd be very welcome. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Thanks very much for watching.